He will not recover from the blow, another of the Pyrrhonians said. He will try to make peace with the world, and he will end up among the Jesuits. Roberto thought now of that dialogue. The void and space were like time, or time was like the void and space. Sidereal spaces exist where our Earth appears like an ant, and so do spaces such as the world of corals, the ants of our universe, and all these spaces are one inside the other. Was it therefore unthinkable that there could be worlds subject to different times? Has it not been said that on Jove one day lasts a year? Therefore worlds must exist that live and die in the space of an instant, or survive beyond our ability to calculate both the Chinese dynasties and the date of the flood. Worlds where all movements and the response to those movements do not occupy the time of hours and minutes but of millennia. Did there not exist, and close at hand, a place where the time was yesterday? Perhaps he had already entered one of those worlds where, once an atom of water had begun corroding the shell of a dead coral, now crumbled and scattered by the many years that had passed, as many as those from the birth of Adam to the redemption. And was he not living his own love in this time, where Lilia, like the orange dove, had become something for whose conquest he now had at his disposal the tedium of centuries? Was he not preparing to live in an infinite future? Towards many similar reflections a young gentleman who had only recently discovered those corals felt himself driven. And there is no knowing where he would have arrived if he had had the spirit of a true philosopher. But Roberto was not a philosopher, instead he was an unhappy lover barely emerging from a venture, all things considered, not crowned with success, towards an island that eluded him in the icy brooms of the day before. He was, however, a lover who though educated in Paris had not forgotten his country life. Therefore he came to conclude that the time he was thinking about could be stretched in 1,000 ways like dough made with egg yolks, as he had seen the women at La Griva knead it. I do not know why Roberto hit upon this simile, perhaps too much thinking had whetted his appetite, or perhaps, terrified by the eternal silence of all those infinities, he would have liked to be home again in the maternal kitchen. He soon went on to recall other rustic delicacies. There were the pies stuffed with little birds, hares, and pheasants, as if to affirm that there can be many worlds, one next to the other or world within a world. But his mother also made those cakes known as German style, with 7 layers or stripes of fruit partitioned with butter, sugar, and cinnamon. And from that idea he went on to envision a salted cake, where amid various strata of pastry he put first one of ham, then one of sliced hard-boiled egg, then one of green vegetable. And this led Roberto to think that the universe could be a pan in which different stories were cooking at the same time, each at its own rate but perhaps all with the same characters. And as the eggs that are below in a pie have no notion of what is happening, beyond their layer of pastry, to their fellow eggs or to the ham above them, so in one stratum of the universe one Roberto could not know what the other was doing. Granted, this is not a refined way of reasoning, and with the belly, moreover. But it is obvious he already had in mind the point at which he wanted to arrive. In a single moment many different Robertos could be doing different things, perhaps under different names. Perhaps under the name of Ferranti? In that case, could the story he believed he was inventing about an enemy brother not be the obscure perception of a world where to him, Roberto, other vicissitudes were occurring, different from those he was experiencing in this world and at this time? Come now, he said to himself, of course you would have liked to be the one experiencing what Ferranti experienced when the Tweed Daphne unfurled her sails to the wind. But this we know because, as Saint Savin said, there exist thoughts we do not think about at all, though they make an impression on the heart without the heart, still less the mind, becoming aware, and it is inevitable that some of these thoughts, which at times are nothing but obscure desires, and not even all that obscure, should be introduced into the universe of the romance that you think you are conceiving for the pleasure of portraying the thoughts of others. But I am I, and Ferranti is Ferranti, and now I will prove it, having him experience adventures of which I could not be the protagonist, and which, if they take place in any universe, it is that of imagination, parallel to none other. And he took pleasure, all that night long, heedless of the corals, in conceiving an adventure that, however, would lead him once again to the most lacerated delight, the most exquisite suffering. Chapter 35. Joyful news out of the newfound world. Ferranti had told Lilia, now ready to believe any falsehoods that might come from those beloved lips, a story almost true, except that in it he played the part of Roberto, and Roberto that of Ferranti, and he convinced her to sacrifice all the jewels in the casket she had brought with her to find the usurper and tear from him a document of capital importance to the fate of the nation, which the other had torn from him, and with which, returning it, he could obtain the cardinal's pardon. After fleeing the French shores, the Tweed Daphne's first port of call was Amsterdam. There Ferranti, double spy that he was, could find someone able to give him information of a ship named the Amaryllis. Whatever that information was, a few days later he was in London looking for someone else. And the man to whom he addressed himself could only have been a villain of his own stamp, ready to betray those for whom he was betraying others. So Ferranti, having received from Lilia a diamond of great purity, was seen entering at night a pothouse where he was welcomed by a creature of dubious sex, perhaps a former eunuch of the Turks, with a glabrous face and a mouth so small you would have said he smiled only by moving his nose. The room Ferranti stole into was frightful thanks to the smuts from a pile of bones burning in a smoldering fire. In one corner a naked corpse was hanging by its feet, secreting a nettle-colored liquid from its mouth into a copper basin. The eunuch recognized Ferranti as a brother in crime. He heard the question, saw the diamond, and betrayed his masters. He led him into another room that looked like an apothecary's shop, filled with jars of clay, glass, tin, copper. All contained substances that served to alter the aspect of their users. Crones who wanted to appear young and beautiful, miscreants who sought to disguise their features. There were rouges, emollients, asphodel roots, tarragon bark, and a substance made with stag marrow and water of honeysuckle that refined the skin. He had pastes to turn the hair blonde, a mixture of green ilex, rye, white harehound, soda niter, alum, and yarrow. Or to change the complexion there were compounds of stallion, bear, camel, snake, rabbit, whale, mare, bittern, doe, wildcat, and otter. Also an oil for the face made of styrax, lemon, pine nut, elm, lupin, vetch, and chickpea, and a shelf of bladders with which strumpets could seem virgins. For those who would ensnare a lover he had viper tongues, quail heads, ass's brains, pilewort, badger's paws, stones from eagle's nest, hearts shaped in tallow thick with broken needles, and other objects made of mud and lead most repugnant to the sight. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it was a basin covered with a bloodied cloth, to which the eunuch pointed with a look of complicity. Ferrante did not understand, and his host assured him he had come to the right man. In fact, the eunuch was none other than he who had wounded Dr. Bird's dog and who, every day at the agreed time, dipping into vitriol water the cloth steeped in the animal's blood, or holding the same cloth to the fire, had been transmitting to the Amaryllis the signals Bird awaited. The eunuch related everything about Bird's voyage and about the ports where he would surely have called. Ferrante, who truly knew little or nothing of the matter of longitudes, could not imagine that Mazarin had sent Roberto on that ship only to learn something that to him now seemed obvious, so he concluded that what Roberto was really meant to reveal to the cardinal was the location of the Islands of Solomon. He believed the Tweed Daphne swifter than the Amaryllis, he trusted his luck, he thought he would easily overtake Bird's ship, and, since it would have landed on the islands, he could more easily surprise the crew ashore, exterminate them, Roberto included, and then dispose of that territory at his pleasure, as he would be its sole discoverer. It was the eunuch who suggested to him the method of proceeding without mistaking his course. It would suffice to wound another dog, and every day act upon a sample of its blood, as the eunuch did for the Amaryllis dog, and Ferrante would receive the same daily messages that Bird received. "I will sail at once," Ferrante said, and when the other reminded him that first a dog would have to be found, "I have a far better dog on board," he exclaimed. He took the eunuch onto the ship, made sure that among the crew there was a barber expert in phlebotomy and other similar chores. "I, Captain," declared one who had eluded 100 nooses and 1,000 fetters, "when we ran the seas, I cut off more arms and legs of comrades than I wounded enemies." Descending into the hold, Ferrante chained Biscarat to 2 stakes crossed obliquely and, grasping a knife, deeply cut the captain's hip. As Biscarat moaned, the eunuch collected the dripping blood with a cloth he had put in a bucket. Then he explained to the barber how he should keep the wound open for all the duration of the voyage, not allowing the wounded man to die but also not allowing the wound to heal. After this latest crime, Ferrante ordered the men to set sail for the Islands of Solomon. Having written this chapter, Roberto felt disgust and weariness, himself crushed by the labor of so many evil deeds. He no longer wanted to imagine the sequel, and instead he wrote an invocation to nature, praying that, as a mother, wishing to make her baby sleep in his cradle, draws a cloth over it and covers him in his own little night, she draws deep night over the planet. He prayed that night, stealing everything from his view, bid his eyes close, that, together with darkness, silence come, and that, as at the rise of the sun, lions, bears, and wolves, to whom, as to thieves and assassins, daylight is hateful, run to hide in caves where they find refuge and safety. As the sun withdrew beyond the west, all the din and the tumult of his thoughts retire. That, once the light was dead, the spirits that the light revived in him would be stunned, and mute repose would reign. When he blew out the lamp, his hands were illuminated only by a lunar ray entering from outside. A fog rose from his stomach to his brain and, falling on his eyelids, closed them so that his spirit could no longer peer out and see any distracting object. And not only did his eyes and ears sleep, but also his hands and feet, everything save the heart, which never rests. Does the soul also sleep during such repose? Alas, no. It remains wakeful, only it withdraws behind a curtain and becomes theater. Then phantom zanies come on stage and perform a comedy, but such as a company of drunken or mad actors might play. So travestied seem the characters, so strange the dress and lewd the attitudes, so inappropriate the situations, so outrageous the speech. As when you cut a centipede into several parts, and the separated sections run off blindly, because except for the first, which comprises the head, the others cannot see. And each, like a healthy roach, goes off on the 5 or 6 legs left him, carrying away that piece of soul that is his. Similarly, in dreams, from the stem of a flower you see a crane's neck sprout, ending in a baboon's head with 4 snails' horns that spit fire, or you see blossoming from an old man's chin a peacock's tail as beard. Another man's arms look like twisted vines, and his eyes are lights glowing in a conch shell, and his nose is a reed pipe. Roberto, who was sleeping, thus dreamed Ferrante's voyage as it continued, only he was dreaming it as a dream. A revelatory dream, I would say. It almost seems that Roberto, after his meditations on infinite worlds, no longer wanted to imagine a plot unfolding in the land of romances but, rather, a real story in a real land, a land he also inhabited, except that, as the island lay in the simple past, his story could take place in a not distant future, which could satisfy his desire for a space less confined than that to which his shipwreck had sentenced him. If he had begun the story by presenting a generic Ferrante and Iago, his rancor conceived for an offense never suffered, a Ferrante who now, unable to bear the sight of the other at Lilia's side, was taking his place, then, daring to recognize his darkest thoughts, Roberto would have admitted openly that Ferrante was himself. Now Roberto was persuaded that the world could be experienced from infinite parallaxes. Before, he had set himself up as an indiscreet eye to study Ferrante's actions in the land of romances, or in a past that had also been his own. That past had barely touched him without his realizing it, as it was determining his present. Roberto was now becoming the eye of Ferrante, for in the company of his adversary he wanted to enjoy the events that fate held in store. So now the vessel proceeded across the liquid meadows, and the pirates were docile. Watching over the voyage of the two lovers, the buccaneers confined themselves to discovering marine monsters and, before arriving on the American shores, they sighted a trident. As for the part visible out of the water, the creature had a human form, except that the arms were short in proportion to the body. The hands were big, the hair gray and thick, and it had a beard down to its stomach. Its eyes were large, its skin rough. As they approached it, it seemed submissive and moved towards the net. But as soon as it felt the men drawing it to the boat, and even before it could reveal itself below the navel, showing whether or not it had a fish's tail, it ripped the net with one blow and vanished. Later it was seen taking the sun on a rock, but still hiding the lower part of its body. Looking at the ship, it waved its arms as if applauding. After entering the Pacific Ocean, they arrived at an island where the lions were black and the hens clad in wool, where the trees flowered only at night, the fish had wings and the birds scales, stones floated and wood sank, butterflies shone in the dark, and water was intoxicating like wine. On a second island they saw a palace built of rotting wood, painted with colors that offended the eye. They entered and found themselves in a hall lined with ravens' feathers. In every wall there were niches where instead of stone busts they saw homunculi with emaciated faces, who by an accident of nature had been born without legs. On a filthy throne sat the king, who with a wave of his hand initiated a concert of hammers, drills that screeched against stone slabs, and knives that squeaked on porcelain plates. At the noise men appeared, all skin and bones, abominable in their distorted gaze. Opposite them appeared some women, the fattest imaginable. Bowing to their companions, they began a dance that underlined their deformity and awkwardness. Then 6 brutes burst in, looking as if all had been born of one womb, their noses and mouths so big, and backs so gibbous, that they seemed not so much creatures as lies of nature. After the dance our travelers, having heard not one word uttered and assuming that on this island a language was spoken different from their own, tried asking questions with gestures, that universal language in which one can communicate also with savages. But the man replied in a language that resembled, rather, the lost language of birds, made of trills and whistles, and they understood it as if it were their native tongue. They learned that whereas in every other place beauty was prized, in this palace only the hideous was appreciated. And this was what they should expect if they continued their voyage to lands where what is normally above lies below. Resuming the journey, they reached a third island, which seemed deserted, and Ferrante, alone with Lilia, ventured into the interior. As they advanced, they heard a voice that counseled them to flee. This was the island of invisible men. At that very instant there were many natives around the couple, pointing at the two visitors who shamelessly exposed themselves to the gaze of others. For these people, in fact, being looked upon, one became the victim of another's gaze and lost his own nature, transformed into the opposite of himself. On a fourth island they found a man with hollow eyes, a thin voice, his face all a single wrinkle, but with fresh colors. His beard and hair were like cotton wool, his body so palsied that when he turned, he had to make a complete revolution. He said he was 340 years old, and in that time he had renewed his youth 3 times, having drunk the water from the fount of youth, which rose in that very land, prolonging life but not beyond 340 years. Hence in a short while he would die. The old man warned the travelers not to seek the fountain. Living there, becoming first the double then the triple of oneself was a source of great afflictions, and in the end one no longer knew who one was. And worse. Living the same sorrows 3 times was a suffering, but it was a suffering to relive even the same joys. The joy of life is born from feeling, whether it be joy or grief, always of short duration, and woe to those who know they will enjoy eternal bliss. But the antipodal world was beautiful in its variety, and, sailing another 1,000 miles, they reached a 5th island, which was only a pullulation of ponds. Each inhabitant spent his life on his knees at a pond, contemplating himself, believing that one who is not seen is as if non-existent, and if they were to look away, ceasing to see themselves in the water, they would die. They landed then at a 6th island, still farther to the west, where all the natives talked among themselves incessantly, one telling another what he would like the other to be and do, and vice versa. Those islanders, in fact, could live only if they were narrated. If a transgressor told unpleasant stories about others, forcing them to enact the events, the others would cease telling anything about him, and he would die. But their concern was to invent for each individual a different story. If they all had the same story, they would not be able to tell one another apart, because each is what his experiences have created. That is why they had constructed a great wheel which they called Cynosure Census. Erected in the village square, it was made up of 6 concentric circles that revolved separately. The first was divided into 24 slots or windows, the second into 36, the third into 48, the fifth into 72, the sixth into 84. In the various slots, according to a system that Lilia and Ferrandi could not grasp in so short a time, were written actions, such as come, go, die, passions, such as hate, love, indifference, then manners, good or ill, sorrow or happiness, and places and times, at home or next month. Spinning the wheels created stories like, he went yesterday to his home and met his enemy who was suffering, and helped him, or else, he saw an animal with 7 heads and killed it. The inhabitants declared that with this machine they could write or think 722 million different stories, and there were enough to give meaning to the lives of each of them for centuries to come. This pleased Roberto, because he would be able to build a wheel of this sort and go on thinking up stories even if he were to remain on the Daphne for 10,000 years. Many and bizarre were the discoveries of lands that Roberto himself would have liked to discover. But at a certain point in his dreaming he wanted a less populous place for the two lovers, so that they could bask in their love. Thus he had them arrive at a 7th and most lovely beach, enhanced by a little wood standing at the shore of the sea. They crossed it and found themselves in a royal garden where, along a shady alley among lawns decorated with beds of flowers, many fountains played. But Roberto, as if the pair were seeking a more private refuge and he knew sufferings, caused them to reach a flowering arch, beyond which they stepped into a little vale where reeds of some marshy cane rustled in a breeze that scattered in the air a mixture of perfumes. And from a little pool, down glistening steps, a line of water bubbled as pure as a string of pearls. He wanted, and I feel his staging followed all the rules, the thick shade of an oak to encourage the lovers at their feast, and he further added gay plane trees, humble arbutus, prickly junipers, fragile tamarisks, and supple limes garlanding a lawn illuminated like an oriental tapestry. With what would nature, the painter of the world, have adorned it? Violets and narcissus. He left the two to their abandon, while a limp poppy raised from heavy oblivion its drowsy head to drink in those dewy sighs. But then he preferred that, humiliated by such beauty, it flush with shame and self-contempt. As he, Roberto, did, and we can only say it served him right. To avoid seeing further what he would so have liked himself to be seen doing, Roberto then rose with his morphetic omniscience to overlook the entire island, where now the fountains commented on the amorous miracle of which they wished to be patrons. There were little columns, ampules, phials from which a single jet spurted, or many, from many little spouts, and others had at their summit a kind of arc from whose windows a flow descended, forming as it fell a doubly weeping willow. 1. A single cylindrical stem, generated at its head many smaller, similar cylinders facing in various directions, as if it were a casemate or fortress or ship of the line armed with cannon, and artillery of water. Some were plumed, or maned, or bearded, in as many varieties as the stars of the Magi and Nativities, whose tails their jets imitated. On one stood the statue of a boy holding an umbrella in his left hand, its ribs ending in as many jets, while in his right the child held his tiny member and mingled in a stoop his urine with the waters coming from the dome above him. In another, on a capital lay a tailed fish that seemed to have just swallowed Jonah, and it expelled water from its mouth as well as from 2 holes opening above its eyes. And astride it was a cupid armed with a trident. A fountain in the form of a flower supported, with its central jet, a ball, while another was a tree, whose many blooms, each one, made a sphere spin, and it seemed so many planets were moving one around the other in the globe of the water. There were fountains where the very petals of the flower were of water, pouring from a continuous slit bordering a wheel set on a column. Replacing air with water, organ pipes emitted not sounds but liquefied breaths, and others were like candelabra, water enacting fire, where flames burning in the center of the column cast lights on the foam rising on all sides. Another seemed a peacock, crested, with a broad tail opened, for which the sky supplied the colors. Not to mention fountains that looked like stands to support a wig and were adorned with flowing locks. In one, a sunflower opened in a single dew. Another had the face of the sun itself, finely sculpted, with a series of nozzles around its circumference, so that the celestial body emitted not rays but coolness. On one a cylinder rotated, ejaculating water from a series of spiral furrows. There were fountains with the mouths of lions or tigers, with griffin's maw and serpent's tongue, and one was a female weeping from her eyes and her teats. And for the rest it was all a vomiting of fawns, a purling of winged creatures, a whispering of swans, a showering from Nile elephants' trunks, a spilling of alabaster vessels, an emptying of cornucopias. Visions that for Roberto, on closer study, were a fall from the frying pan into the fire. Meanwhile in the vale the now sated lovers had only to reach out and accept from a leafy vine the gift of its treasures, and a fig, as if wishing to weep tenderly over the spied-on union, distilled tears of honey, while on an almond tree bejeweled with blossoms lamented the orange dove. Then Roberto woke, soaked with sweat. What? He said to himself reproachfully. I succumbed to the temptation to live through Ferrandi, and now I realize that it is Ferrandi who has lived through me, that as I was moping, he was truly experiencing what I permitted him to experience. To cool his anger, and to have visions that, these, at least, were denied Ferrandi, he again set out early in the morning, rope around his loins and persona vitrea on his face, towards his world of coral. Chapter 36. The Rule and Exercises of Holy Dying. Reaching the edge of the reef, Roberto swam with his face submerged among those endless loggias, but he was unable to admire the animated rocks serenely because a Medusa had transformed him into inanimate stone. In his dream he had seen the looks Lilia bestowed on the usurper, and if in the dream those looks had inflamed him, now in waking memory they froze him. Roberto wanted to regain possession of his Lilia. He swam, thrusting his face down as far as possible, as if that embrace with the sea could award him the prize that in his dream he had awarded Ferrante. It did not require a great effort, on the part of his spirit trained to form concepts, to imagine Lilia in every undulant cadence of that submerged part, to see her lips in every flower, where he would lose himself like a greedy bee. In transparent greenery he found again the veil that had covered her face on the first nights, and he stretched out his hand to raise that screen. In this intoxication of his reason, he regretted that his eyes could not rove as freely as his heart wished, and among the corals he sought his beloved's bracelet, her snood, the bangle that beguiled the lobe of her ear, the sumptuous necklaces that adorned her swan-like neck. Lost in his search, he allowed himself at one point to be attracted by a jewel that appeared to him in a crevasse. He removed his mask, arched his back, raised his legs vigorously, and forced himself towards the seabed. The thrust was excessive. He tried to grasp the edge of a shelf. Just before closing his fingers around a crusted rock, he seemed to see a fat and sleepy eye open. At that same instant he remembered Dr. Bird had spoken to him of a stone fish that lurks among the coral caverns to surprise any living creature with the venom of its scales. Too late. His hand had rested on the thing and an intense pain shot through his arm to his shoulder. With a twist of his trunk he managed miraculously not to end up with his face and chest on top of the monster, but to arrest his momentum he had to strike it with the mask. In the impact the mask shattered, but he had to let go of it anyway. Pressing his feet against the rock below, he pushed himself up to the surface while in the space of a few seconds he saw the persona vitrea sink out of sight. His right hand and his entire forearm were swollen, his shoulder numb. He was afraid he might faint. He found the rope and with great effort gradually succeeded in pulling it, a little at a time, with one hand. He climbed the ladder, much as he had on the night of his arrival, not knowing how, and, as on that night, he slumped to the deck. But now the sun was already high. His teeth chattering, Roberto recalled Dr. Bird telling him that after an encounter with the stonefish most humans were doomed. A few did survive, but no one knew an antidote against that suffering. Though his eyes were clouded, he tried to examine the wound. It was no more than a scratch, but it must have been enough to allow the mortal substance to penetrate his veins. He lost consciousness. When he woke, his fever was raging and he felt an intense thirst. He realized that on this edge of the ship, exposed to the elements, far from food and drink, he would not last long. He crawled below and reached the partition between the stores and the chicken pen. He drank greedily from a keg of water, but he felt his stomach contract. He fainted again, his face in his own vomit. During a night racked by fierce dreams, he attributed his sufferings to Ferrante, whom he now confused with the stone fish. Why did Ferrante want to block his way to the island and to the dove? Was this why he had set out in pursuit of Roberto? He could see himself lying there and looking at another self seated opposite him, beside a stove, dressed in a house robe, trying to decide if the hands he touched and the body he felt were his. He, who saw the other, felt his clothes on fire. Then, while the other was clothed, he was naked, but he no longer knew which of the two was awake and which asleep, and he thought that both were surely figures produced by his mind. No, not he, because he thought, and therefore he was. The other, bewitched, at a certain point stood up, but he had to be the evil genius who was transforming Roberto's world into dream, for already he was no longer himself but Father Casper. "You've come back," Roberto murmured, holding out his arms. But the priest did not answer or move. He looked at him. It was surely Father Casper, but as if the sea, giving him up, had cleansed and rejuvenated him. His beard was trimmed, his face plump and roseate like Padre Emanuele's, his habit unwrinkled and neat. Then, still motionless, like an actor declaiming, and in impeccable language, a skilled orator, he said with a grim smile, "It is useless for you to defend yourself. Now the whole world has a single destination, and it is hell." He went on in a loud voice, as if speaking from the pulpit of a church. "Yes, hell, of which you know little, you and all those who along with you are proceeding with Lightfoot and Mad Spirit. Did you believe that in hell you would find swords, daggers, wheels, razors, streams of sulfur, potions of molten lead, frozen waters, cauldrons and grates, saws and clubs, awls to gouge out eyes, pincers to pull teeth, combs to rip open flanks, chains to pound the bones, animals that gnaw, hooks that pull, thongs that choke, racks, crosses, goads, and axes? No, those are merciless torments, true, but such as the human mind can still conceive, as we have also conceived bronze bulls, seats of iron, and sharpened reeds to push under fingernails. You hoped hell was a reef made up of stone fish. No, the torments of hell are something different, because they are born not from our finite mind but from the infinite mind of a wrathful and vindictive God, forced to display his fury and show that as his mercy was great in absolution, no less great is his justice in punishment. They must be such torments that in them we can see the gulf between our impotence and his omnipotence. In this world, that messenger of penance continued, you are used to seeing that for every ill a remedy is found, that there is no wound without its balm, no venom without its theriac. But you must not think it is the same in hell. Burns there, it is true, are highly troublesome, but there is no liniment that soothes them. Thirst sears, but there is no water to slake it. Hunger is rabid, but no food allays it. Unendurable is the shame, but no cover can cover it. If there were at least death to put an end to such woe, death, death. But this is the worst, for there you can never hope for a deliverance, even one as grievous as your own extermination. You will seek death in all its forms, you will seek death and never be fortunate enough to find it. Death, death, where art thou? You will shout constantly, but what demon would be merciful and offer it to you? And you will understand that down there the suffering never ends. The old man paused, extended his arms, his hands turned towards heaven, as he muttered in a whisper, as if to confide a tremendous secret that should never go beyond that nave. Suffering that never ends? Does that mean we shall suffer until a little goldfinch, drinking one drop every year, succeeds in draining all the world's seas? No, longer. In secula, shall we suffer until a plant louse, taking one bite every year, has devoured every forest? No, longer. In secula, will we suffer, then, until an ant, taking one step every year, has circled the entire earth? No, longer. In secula. And if all this universe were desert and once every century a single grain were taken from it, would we perhaps end our suffering when the universe was empty? Not even then. In secula. Assume that a damned soul, after millions of centuries, can shed only 2 tears, will we then continue suffering until his weeping has sufficed to form a flood greater than that which in ancient times destroyed the human race? Come now, enough of this, we are not children. If you want me to say it, then, in secula must the damned suffer, in secula, which means centuries without number, without end, without measure. Now Father Casper's face seemed that of the Carmelite at Lagriva. He raised his eyes as if to find in heaven his sole hope of mercy. But what of God, he said with the voice of a penitent worthy of compassion, yes, what of God? Does he not suffer at the sight of our sufferings? Will he not feel a pang of concern? In the end will he not reveal himself, so we can be consoled at least by his weeping? Alas, ye innocent! God, unfortunately, will show himself, but you still cannot imagine how. When we raise our eyes, we will see that he, must I say it? We will see that he, having become for us a Nero, not in injustice but in severity, will not console us or succor us or sympathize with us, but, rather, he will laugh with inconceivable delight. Imagine what ravings must then seize us. We burn, we will say, and God laughs? We burn, and God laughs? Oh, most cruel God! Why do you not torture us with your thunderbolts, rather than insult us with your laughter? Redouble, merciless one, our flames, but do not rejoice in them. Ah, your laughter for us is more bitter than our tears. Ah, your joy to us is more grievous than our woes. Why does our hell not have chasms where we can flee the countenance of a God that laughs? Too long have we been deceived by those who told us that our punishment would be the sight of the face of a scornful God. A laughing God, we should have been told, a laughing God. Rather than see and hear that laughter we would have the mountains collapse on our heads, or the earth disappear beneath our feet. But no, in our misfortune we shall see what pains us, and be blind and deaf to everything except to what we wish to be blind and deaf. Roberto smelled the sour odor of the chicken feed in the gaps of the planks, and from outside came the mewing of the seabirds, which he had mistaken for the laughter of God. But why hell for me? He asked. And why for all? Was it not to keep it only for a few that Christ redeemed us? Father Casper laughed like the God of the damned. Why, when did he redeem you? On what planet, in what universe do you think you are living now? He took Roberto's hand, raising him violently from where he lay, and dragged him through the maze of the Daphne as the sick man felt a gnawing at his intestine, and it was as if his head housed only folia clocks. Clocks, he thought. Time, death. Casper dragged him into a room he had never discovered, its walls white. There Roberto saw a closed catafalque with a circular eye on one side. Before the eye, on a grooved runner, was inserted a little wooden strip fitted with several eyes, all the same size, framing pieces of opaque glass. As the strip was moved along the groove, the eyes could be aligned serially with the eye of the box. Roberto recalled having once seen in Provence a smaller version of this machine that, it was said, could bring light to life thanks to shadows. Father Casper opened the side of the box, allowing a glimpse of a great lamp on a tripod. On the side opposite the spout the lamp had, not a handle, but a round, specially curved mirror. When the lamp's wick was lit, the mirror projected the luminous rays into a pipe, a short spyglass whose terminal lens was that external eye. From here, as soon as Casper had closed the box again, the rays passed through the glass of the strip, broadening in a cone and casting on the wall some colored images, which to Roberto seemed truly alive, so vivid and precise were they. The first figure represented a man with a demon's face chained to a rock in the midst of the sea, lashed by the waves. Roberto could not tear his eyes from that apparition. He blended it with those that followed, as Father Casper caused them to appear, sliding the strip of wood, and composed them all, dream within dream, without distinguishing what was being said to him from what he was seeing. A ship was approaching the rock, and he recognized it as the Tweed Daphne. From it Ferrandi descended, now freeing the chained man. All was clear. In the course of his voyaging, Ferranti had found Judas, as the legend assures us he was to be found, imprisoned upon the open sea, to expiate his betrayal. "Thank you," Judas said to Ferranti, but to Roberto the voice surely came from the lips of Caspar. "From the time I was bound here until the 9th hour today I have hoped to be able yet to atone for my sin." "I thank you, brother. You have been here only a day, or even less," Ferranti said, "but your sin was committed in the 33rd year after the birth of our Lord, and therefore 1610 years ago." "Ah, simple mind," Judas replied, "it is surely 1610 of your years since I was set on this rock, but it is not yet and never will be one day for me. You do not know that, entering the sea that surrounds this island of mine, you penetrated another world that flows alongside and within yours, and here the sun moves around the earth like a tortoise whose every step is slower than the one before. So in this my world, at the beginning my day lasted 2 of yours, and then 3, and so on, more and more, until now, after 1610 of your years, I am still and always at the 9th hour. And soon time will be even slower, and then slower still, and I will live always at the 9th hour of the year 33 after that night in Bethlehem." "But why?" Ferranti asked. "Why, because God has willed that my punishment consist in living always on Good Friday, to celebrate always and every day the passion of the man I betrayed. The first day of my suffering, when for other human beings sunset approached, and then night, and then the dawn of Saturday, for me only an atom of a minute of the 9th hour of that Friday had gone by. As the course of my sun began to move even more slowly, for the rest of you Christ was rising from the dead, but I was still barely a step from that hour. And now, when centuries and centuries have passed for you, I am still only a crumb of time from that instant. But still this sun of yours moves, and the day will come, even if after 10,000 years and more, when you will enter your Saturday. Yes, and then it will be worse. I will have left my purgatory to enter my hell. My grief at the death I caused will not cease, but I will have lost the possibility, which still remains to me, of making what happened not happen. But how? You do not know that not far from here runs the antipodal meridian. Beyond that line, both in your world and in mine, lies the day before. If I, now freed, could cross that line, I would be in my Holy Thursday, for this scapular that you see on my back is the bond that requires my sun to accompany me like my shadow, and guarantee that wherever I go, all time has the duration of mine. I could then reach Jerusalem, traveling through a very long Thursday, and I could arrive there before the completion of my wickedness. And I would save my master from his fate. But, Ferranti objected, if you prevent the passion, then there will never be the redemption, and the world will still be stained by original sin. Judas shouted, crying. I was thinking only of myself. But what must I do then? If I continue to let myself act as I acted, I remain damned. If I amend my error, I confound the plan of God and will be punished by damnation. Was it then written from the beginning that I was damned to be damned? The procession of images went dark at the weeping of Judas, as the oil of the lamp was consumed. Father Caspar was speaking again, in a voice Roberto no longer recognized as his. The scant light now came from a fissure in the wall and illuminated only half of the priest's face, distorting the line of his nose and making the color of his beard uncertain, very white on one side and very dark on the other. The eyes were both hollows, because the one exposed to the light seemed also in shadow. Roberto realized only then that it was covered by a black patch. And it is at that point, he said now, this man who was surely the Abbé de Morphy, it is at that moment that your brother conceives the masterstroke of his genius. If he makes the journey Judas has suggested, he can prevent the passion from taking place, and thus prevent redemption from being granted us. No redemption, all men victims of the same original sin, all doomed to hell, your brother a sinner. But a sinner like all humankind, and therefore justified. But how could he, how can he, how did he? Roberto asked. Oh, the Abbé smiled with horrid glee, it required very little. It sufficed only to deceive the Almighty as well, who is incapable of conceiving every travesty of the truth. It sufficed to kill Judas, as I promptly did on that rock, put on his scapular, send my ship ahead to the opposite shore of the island, arrive here in disguise to prevent your learning the correct rules of swimming so you could never precede me over there, then force you to construct with me the aquatic belt to enable me to reach the island. And as he spoke, he slowly removed his habit, appearing in pirate garb, then equally slowly he removed the beard, rid himself of the wig, and Roberto thought he was seeing himself in a mirror. Ferranti, he cried, in person, my dear brother. I, who, as you were struggling like a dog or a frog, found my ship again on the far side of the island, and sailed through my long Thursday towards Jerusalem, found the other Judas on the verge of betraying, hanged him from a fig tree, preventing him from handing over the Son of Man to the sons of darkness, entered the Garden of Olives with my men and abducted our Lord, stealing him from Calvary. And now you, all of us are living in a world that has never been redeemed. But Christ? Where is Christ now? Do you then not know that the ancient texts already said there are doves the color of flame because the Lord, before being crucified, wore a scarlet tunic? Have you not yet understood? For 1610 years Christ has been prisoner on the island, whence he tries to escape in the form of an orange dove, but is unable to abandon that place, where next to the specula melitensis I have left Judas's scapular, and where it is therefore forever the same day. Now all I have to do is kill you, and live free in a world where remorse is banned, hell is certain for all, and where one day I shall be crowned the new Lucifer. And he drew a dirk, took a step towards Roberto to commit his final crime. No, Roberto shouted, I will not allow it. I will kill you and free Christ. I can still wield my sword, and it was to me, not to you, that my father taught his secrets. I have had only one father, one mother, your festered mind, Ferrante said with a sad smile. You taught me only to hate. Do you think you have given me a great gift, giving me life so that in your land of romances I could embody suspicion? As long as you are alive, thinking for me what I must think, I will never cease to despise myself. So whether you kill me or I kill you, the end is the same. On guard. Forgive me, my brother, Roberto cried. Yes, let us fight. It is fitting that one of us die. What did Roberto want? To die, to set Ferrante free by making him die? Prevent Ferrante from preventing the redemption? We will never know, for he did not know the answer himself. But this is the way of dreams. They climbed up on deck. Roberto hunted for his weapon and found it reduced, as we will recall, to a stump, but he shouted that God would give him strength, and a good swordsman can fight even with a broken blade. The two brothers confronted each other for the first time, to begin their last conflict. The heavens were ready to abet the fratricide. A reddish cloud suddenly cast between ship and sky a bloody shadow as if, up above, they had slaughtered the horses of the sun. A great concert of thunder and lightning erupted, followed by a downpour, and sky and sea deafened the duelers, dazzling their vision, striking their hands with icy water. But the two darted here and there among the thunderbolts that rained around them, attacking each other with blows and side cuts, suddenly falling back, clutching a hawser, almost flying to avoid a thrust, hurling abuse, cadencing every attack with a cry, among the equal cries of the wind howling around them. On that slippery deck Roberto was fighting so that Christ could be nailed to the cross, and he invoked divine aid. Ferrante, to prevent Christ's suffering, invoked the names of all the devils. Called to assist him was Astaroth, as the intruder, now intruding also into the plans of Providence, offered himself involuntarily to the coup de la muette. Or perhaps this is what he wished, to conclude that dream that had neither beginning nor end. Roberto pretended to fall, the other rushed to finish him off. Roberto, leaning on his right hand, thrust the broken sword at his opponent's chest. He did not spring up with the agility of Saint Savin, but Ferrante at this point had accumulated too much impetus and could not avoid being stuck, or rather, impaling himself at his sternum on the stump of the blade. Roberto choked on the blood that poured from the mouth of his enemy, in death. He tasted blood in his mouth, and probably in his delirium he had bitten his tongue. Now he was swimming in that blood, which spread from the ship to the island. He did not want to advance for fear of the stone fish, but he had completed only the first part of his mission. Christ was waiting on the island to shed his blood, and Roberto was now his sole Messiah. What was he doing now in his dream? With Ferrante's dirk he had begun tearing a sail into long strips, which he then knotted together with the help of ropes. On the lower deck he had captured, using thongs, the hardiest of the cranes or storks or whatever they might be, and he was now binding them by their legs, as coursers, to that flying carpet of his. With his aerial ship he rose in flight towards the now attainable land. Under the Speculum Melitensis he found the scapular and destroyed it. Having restored space to time, he saw descending upon him the dove, which finally, ecstatic, he saw in all its glory. But it was natural, or, rather, supernatural, that the bird now should appear to him not orange but white. Yet it could not be a dove, for the dove is not suited to represent the second person of the Trinity. It was perhaps a pious pelican, as the sun must be. Roberto could not clearly see what bird was offered him as sweet topsail for that winged vessel. He only knew that he was flying upwards, and images followed one another as the mad phantoms would have it. They were now navigating in the direction of all the innumerable and infinite worlds, to every planet, to every star, so that on each, as if in a single moment, the redemption would be achieved. The first planet they reached was the pure moon, on a night illuminated by the Earth's midday. And the Earth hung on the line of the horizon, an enormous looming boundless polenta of cornmeal still cooking in the sky and almost falling upon him, gurgling with fevered and feverish fevery ferocity and boiling boils on the boil, plop pee la petit plop. The fact is that when you have the fever, you become polenta, and the lights you see all come from the boiling of your head. And there on the moon, with the dove, we will not have looked for coherence and verisimilitude, I trust, in all I have narrated thus far, because we have been describing the nightmare of a man poisoned by a stone fish. But what I am preparing to narrate surpasses all our expectations. The mind or the heart of Roberto, or in any case his vis imaginativa, was ordering a sacrilegious metamorphosis. On the moon he now saw himself not with the Lord but with the lady, Lilia finally recovered from Ferrante. Roberto, by the lakes of Selene, was receiving what his brother had stolen from him among the ponds of the island of fountains. He kissed her face with his eyes, contemplated her with his mouth, sucked, bit again, and the enamored tongues jested, jousting. Only then did Roberto, whose fever was perhaps abating, come to, but remaining fond of what he had experienced, as happens after a dream departs, leaving not only the spirit affected but also the body. He did not know whether to weep with happiness at his regained love, or to weep with remorse for having turned, thanks to the fever, which ignores the laws of genre, his sacred epic into a libertine comedy. That moment, he told himself, will truly gain me hell, for I am surely no better than Judas or Ferranti. Indeed, I am only Ferranti. Until now I have simply exploited his wickedness in order to dream of doing what my cowardice has always kept me from doing. Perhaps I shall not be called to answer for my sin, because it is not I who sinned, but the stone fish that made me dream in its own way. However, if I have arrived at such mindlessness, it must be a sign that I am truly about to die. I had to wait for the stone fish to make me think of death, whereas this thought should be the first duty of every good Christian. Why have I never thought of death, and of the wrath of a laughing God? Because I was following the teachings of my philosophers, for whom death is a natural necessity and God is he who into the disorder of atoms introduced the law that composes them in the harmony of the cosmos. Could such a God, master of geometry, produce the disorder of hell, even if out of justice, and could he laugh at the subverting of every subversion? No, God does not laugh, Roberto said to himself. He bows to the law that he himself willed, the law that wills the body to decay, as mine is surely decaying in this decadence. And Roberto saw the worms near his mouth, but they were not an effect of his delirium. Amid the filth of the hens, they had formed through spontaneous generation, descendants of that excrement. He then gave welcome to those heralds of decomposition, for he understood that this confounding of himself with viscid matter was to be experienced as the end of all suffering, in harmony with the will of nature and of heaven that administers it. I have only a little while to wait, he murmured, as in a prayer. In the space of not many days my body, now still well composed, will change color and become wan as a bean, then blacken from head to foot and be sheathed in a dark heat. Then tumefaction will begin, and on that bloat a fetid mold will generate. Nor will it be long before the belly begins exploding here and splitting there, releasing rottenness, and here a wormy half-eye will be seen swaying, there a shred of lip. In this mud then a quantity of little flies will be born and other tiny animals that cluster in my blood, and they will consume me bit by bit. One part of these creatures will rise from my bosom, another will drip like mucus from the nostrils, others, drawn by my putrescence, will enter and leave the mouth, and the most sated will gurgle in the throat. And all this while the Daphne little by little becomes the realm of the birds, and germs arriving from the island cause animalesque vegetables to grow here, whose roots, now digging into the bilge, will be nourished by my secretions. Finally, when my whole corporeal fabric has been reduced to pure skeleton, in the course of the months and the years, or perhaps the millennia, that armature will also slowly become a powder of atoms on which the living will walk, not understanding that the whole globe of the earth, its seas, its deserts, its forests, and its valleys, is nothing but a living cemetery. There is nothing more conducive to healing than an exercise in happy death, the rehearsal of which reassures us. So the Carmelite had once said to him, and so it was, for now Roberto felt hunger and thirst. Weaker than when he dreamed of the fighting on the deck, but less so than when he lay by the hens, he found the strength to suck an egg. The liquid that trickled down his throat was good. And even better was the milk of a nut that he opened in the larder. After all that meditating over his dead body, now, to heal it, he incorporated into his body the healthy bodies to which nature gives life every day. This is why, except for some admonitions from the Carmelite, at La Griva no one had taught him to think of death. During family conversation, almost always at dinner and at supper, after Roberto had returned from one of his explorations of the ancient house, and had perhaps lingered in a great shadowy room redolent of apples set on the floor to ripen, the talk was only of the goodness of the melons, the reaping of the wheat, and the expectations for the vintage. Roberto remembered how his mother taught him he could live happily and peacefully if he would employ to advantage all the good things that La Griva gave him. And it would be well for you not to forget to provide yourself with salted meat of the ox, the sheep, or the ram, and of calf and pig, for they keep for some time and are of great use. Cut the pieces of meat not very big, put them in a pot with much salt over them, leave them for 1 week, then hang them from the beams in the kitchen so they can dry in the smoke, and do this in crisp, cold weather, with the westerly winds, after Martinmas, for the meat will then last as long as you wish. In September come the little birds, and lambs for the whole winter, not to mention the capons, the old hens, the ducks, and such like. Do not scorn even the ass if it breaks a leg, for they produce little round sausages that you afterwards score with a knife and set to fry, and they are a dish for a lord. And in Lent, let there always be mushrooms, soups, nuts, grapes, apples, and all God's bounty. And also for Lent turnips must be kept ready, and herbs that, floured and cooked in oil, are better than a lamprey, and you will make sweet Lenten dumplings, with a paste of oil, flour, rosewater, saffron, and sugar, with a drop of malmsey, cut in rounds like old window panes, filled with grated bread, apples, cloves, and crushed walnuts, which, with a pinch of salt you will set in the oven and cook, and you will eat better than any prior. After Easter come the kids, asparagus, pigeons. Later the ricotta arrives and the fresh cheese. But you must also know how to make use of peas and boiled beans floured and fried, which are excellent ornaments for the table. This, my son, if you live as our elders lived, will be a life of bliss, far from all travail. No, at La Griva there was no talk of death, judgment, hell, or paradise. Death, for Roberto, had appeared at Casali, and it had been in Provence and in Paris that he had been led to ponder it, amid virtuous discourse and carefree discourse. I shall surely die, he said to himself, if not now thanks to the stone fish, in any case later, since it is clear that from this ship I shall never wander, now that I have lost, with the persona vitrea, also the means of approaching the barrier safely. What illusion was I harboring? I would die, perhaps later, even if I had not arrived on this wreck. I entered life knowing that the law requires us to leave it. As Saint Savin said, we play our role, some long, some not so long, and then we leave the stage. I have seen others go before me, others will see me go, and they will give the same performance for their successors. For that matter, how long was the time when I did not exist, and for how long in the future will I not be? I occupy a very small space in the abyss of the years. This little interval does not succeed in distinguishing me from the nothingness into which I shall go. I came into the world only to swell the ranks. My part was so small that even if I had remained in the wings, everyone would still have declared the play perfect. It is like a storm at sea. Some drown immediately, others are dashed against the rocks, still others are cast up on an abandoned ship, but not for long, not even they. Life goes out, on its own, like a candle that has consumed its substance. And we should be accustomed to it, because, like a candle, we have been shedding atoms since the moment we were lit. It is no great wisdom to know these things, Roberto told himself. We should know them from the moment we are born. But usually we reflect always and only on the death of others. Ah yes, we all have strength enough to bear others' ills. Then the moment comes when we think of death because the illness is our own, and we realize it is impossible to stare directly at the sun in a death. Unless we have had good teachers. I did. Someone said to me that truly few know death. As a rule it is tolerated through stupidity or habit, not through resolve. We die because we cannot do otherwise. Only the philosopher can think of death as a duty, to be performed willingly and without fear. As long as we are here, death is not here, and when death comes, we have gone. Why would I have spent so much time conversing about philosophy if now I were not capable of making my death the masterwork of my life? His strength was returning. He thanked his mother, whose memory had led him to abandon thoughts of the end. She could not do otherwise, she who had given him the beginning. He set to thinking about his birth, of which he knew far less than of his death. He told himself that thinking of origins is proper to the philosopher. It is easy for the philosopher to justify death. That we must plunge into obscurity is one of the clearest things in the world. What obsesses the philosopher is not the naturalness of the end, it is the mystery of the beginning. We can lack interest in the eternity that will follow us, but we cannot elude the anguished question of which eternity preceded us, the eternity of matter or the eternity of God. This was why he had been cast up on the Daphne, Roberto concluded. Because only in that restful hermitage would he have had the leisure to reflect on the one question that frees us from every apprehension about not being and consigns us to the wonder of being. Chapter 37. Paradoxical exercises regarding the thinking of stones. But how long had he been sick? Days? Weeks? Or had a storm in the meantime struck the ship? Or, even before encountering the stone fish, concentrated as he was on the sea and on his romance, had he not noticed what was happening around him? For how long had he so lost his sense of reality? The Daphne had become a different ship. The deck was dirty and the casks leaked, were coming apart. Some sails had unfurled and were torn, hanging from the arms like masks, winking and grinning among their rents. The birds complained, and Roberto hurried to feed them. Some were dead. Luckily the plants, nourished by rain and air, had grown and some had forced their way into the cages, offering pasture to many. For others, the insects had multiplied. The surviving animals had even procreated, and the few dead had been replaced by many living. The island remained unchanged, except that for Roberto, who had lost his mask, it had moved farther away, drawn by the currents. The reef, now that he knew it was defended by the stone fish, had become insuperable. Roberto could swim again, but only for the love of swimming, while keeping well away from the rocks. "Oh, human machinations, how chimerical you are," he murmured. "If man is nothing but a shadow, you are smoke. If nothing but a dream, you are phantoms. If nothing but a dot, you are zeros. So many deeds," Roberto said to himself, only to learn that I am a zero. Indeed, more of a zero than I was at my arrival as derelict. The shipwreck shook me and led me to fight for life, but now I have nothing to fight for or to fight against. I am condemned to a long repose. I am here to contemplate not the void of spaces, but my own, and from it only ennui will come, sadness and despair. Soon not only I but the Daphne itself will be no more, I and it reduced to fossil, like this coral. For the coral skull was still there on the deck, immune to universal wear, and so, immune to death, it was the only living thing. This alien form gave new vigor to the thoughts of the castaway, who had been educated to discover new lands only through the telescope of the word. If the coral was a living thing, he said to himself, it was the only truly thinking being amid the general disorder of thought. It could think only of its own ordered complexity, about which it knew everything, and thus would have no expectation of unforeseen disruptions of its own architecture. Do objects live and think? The canon had said to him one day that to justify life and its development it is necessary that in everything there be some burgeoning of matter, some spora, some seeds. Molecules are determined arrangements of determined atoms under a determined form, and if God has imposed laws on the chaos of atoms, their composites can tend only to generate analogous composites. Is it possible that the stones we know are still those that survived the flood, that they, too, have not developed, and that from them other stones have not been generated? If the universe is nothing but a collection of simple atoms that clash to generate their composites, it is not possible that the atoms, once composed into their composites, should cease moving. In every object a continuous movement must be maintained. A whirling movement in winds, a fluid and regulated movement in animal bodies, a slow but inexorable movement in vegetables, and surely much slower but not absent in minerals. Even this coral, dead to coralline life, enjoys its own subterranean stirring, proper to a stone. Roberto reflected. Let us assume that every body is composed of atoms, even those bodies purely and solely extended, flat, with which geometricians deal, and let us assume, further, that these atoms are indivisible. It is certain that every straight line can be divided into two equal parts, whatever its length may be. But if its length is minimal, it is possible that we may be dividing into two parts a straight line composed of an odd number of indivisibles. This would mean that if we do not want the two parts to be unequal, the indivisible median has been divided in two. But this, since it is in its turn extended and therefore also a straight line, though of imperceptible brevity, should be in its turn divisible into two parts. And so on ad infinitum. The canon said that the atom is still always made up of parts, only it is so compact that we could never divide it within its confines. But what about others? No solid body exists as compact as gold, and yet we take an ounce of this metal, and from that ounce a goldsmith can make 1,000 gold leaves, and 1/2 of those leaves suffices to gild the entire surface of an ingot of silver. And taking that same ounce of gold, those who prepare the gold and silver filaments for decorating lace can reduce it with their dye to the breadth of a hair, and that thread will be as long as a quarter league or perhaps more. The artisan stops at a certain point because he does not possess adequate instruments, nor can he with the naked eye still discern the thread he might obtain. But some insects, so minuscule that we cannot see them, and so industrious and wise that their skill outstrips that of all the artisans of our species, could refine that thread still further until it stretched from Turin to Paris. And if there existed insects of those insects, to what refinement could they not draw that same thread? If with the eye of Argus I could penetrate the polygons of this coral and the filaments that spread inside it, and inside each filament that which makes up the filament, I could go seeking the atom unto infinity. But an atom divisible to infinity, producing parts ever smaller and ever more divisible, would lead me to a moment where matter would be nothing but infinite divisibility, and all its hardness and its fullness would be sustained by this simple balancing among voids. Matter, rather than feeling a horror of the void, would then worship it and would be composed of it, would be void in itself, absolute vacuity. Absolute vacuity would be at the very heart of the unthinkable geometrical point, and this point would be only the island of utopia we dream of, in an ocean made always and only of water. Hypothesizing a material extension made of atoms, then, we arrive at having no atoms. What remains? Vortices. Except that the vortices would not pull the suns and planets, true matter that feels the influence of their wind, because the suns and planets would themselves be vortices, drawing minor vortices into their spiral. Then the maximum vortex, which makes the galaxies spin, would have in its center other vortices, and these would be vortices of vortices, whirlpools made of other whirlpools, and the abyss of the great whirlpool of whirlpools would sink into the infinite, supported by nothingness. And we, inhabitants of the great coral of the cosmos, believe the atom, which still we cannot see, to be full matter, whereas, it too, like everything else, is but an embroidery of voids in the void, and we give the name of being, dense and even eternal, to that dance of inconsistencies, that infinite extension that is identified with absolute nothingness and that spins from its own non-being the illusion of everything. So here I am eluding myself with the illusion of an illusion. I, an illusion myself? I, who was to lose everything, happened on this vessel lost in the Antipodes only to realize that there was nothing to lose. But, understanding this, do I not perhaps gain everything, because I become the one thinking point at which the universe recognizes its own illusion? And yet, if I think about it, does this not mean I have a soul? Oh, what a tangle. The all is made of nothing, and yet to understand it we must have a soul, which, little as it may be, is not nothing. What am I? If I say I in the sense of Roberto della Griva, I say so inasmuch as I am the memory of all my past moments, the sum of everything I remember. If I say I in the sense of that something that is here at this moment and is not the mainmast or the coral, then I am the sum of what I feel now. But what is what I feel now? It is the sum of those relations between presumed indivisibles that have been arranged in that system of relations in that special order that is my body. And so my soul is not, as Epicurus would have it, a matter composed of corpuscles finer than the others, a breath mixed with heat. It is the way in which these relations are felt as such. What tenuous condensation, what condensed tenuousness. I am only a relation among my parts that are perceived while they are in relation to each other. But these parts are in turn divisible into other relations, and so on. Therefore every system of relations, being aware of itself, being indeed the awareness of self, is a thinking nucleus. I think me, my blood, my nerves, but every drop of my blood thinks itself. Does it think itself as I think me? Surely not. In nature man perceives himself in quite a complex way, the animal a bit less. It is capable of appetite, for example, but not of remorse, and a plant feels itself growing, and surely it feels when it is cut, and perhaps even says I, but in a far more cloudy way than I do. Everything thinks, but according to its complexity. If this is so, then stones also think. This stone, too, which actually is not stone but was a vegetable, or animal. How does it think? Like a stone. If God, who is the great relation of all relations in all the universes, thinks himself thinking, as the philosopher would have it, this stone thinks only itself stoning. God thinks entire reality in the infinite worlds he creates and maintains with his thought. I think of my unhappy love, of my solitude on this ship, of my deceased parents, of my sins and of my death. And this stone thinks only I stone, I stone, I stone. But perhaps it cannot even say it thinks, stone, stone, stone. That must be boring. Or am only I the one who feels bored? I who can think more, while it, or he or she, is entirely content with being stone, as happy as God, because God enjoys being all, as this stone enjoys being almost nothing, but since it knows no other way of being, it is pleased with its own way, eternally satisfied with itself. But is it true, then, that the stone feels nothing but its stoniness? The canon used to say to me that even stones are bodies that on some occasions burn and become other. In fact, a stone falls into a volcano and through the intense heat of that unguent of fire, which the ancients called magma, it melts and fuses with other stones, becomes one incandescent mass, and a short, or long, time later it finds itself part of a larger stone. Is it possible that in ceasing to be that first stone, and at the moment of becoming another, it does not feel its own calefaction, and with it the imminence of its own death? The sun was striking the bridge, a light breeze tempered its heat, Roberto's sweat dried on his skin. After all this time spent picturing himself as stone petrified by the sweet Medusa who had ensnared him in her gaze, he resolved to try to think as stones think, perhaps to prepare himself for the day when he would be a simple pile of white bones exposed to that same sun, that same wind. He stripped, lay down, with his eyes closed and his fingers in his ears so as not to be disturbed by any sound, as is surely the case of a stone, which has no sensory organs. He tried to erase every personal memory, every demand of his own human body. If it had been possible, he would have erased his own skin. Unable to, he tried to make it as insensitive as he could. I am a stone, he said to himself. And then, to avoid even mentioning himself, stone, stone, stone. What would I feel if I were truly a stone? First of all, the movements of the atoms that compose me, that is, the stable vibration of the positions that the parts of my parts maintain among themselves. I would feel the hum of my stoning. But I could not say I, because to say I there must be others, something else against which to oppose myself. In principle the stone cannot know if there is anything outside itself. It hums. Its stoning is a stoning of stoning. Of the rest it knows nothing. It is a world that whirls along on its own. Still, if I touch this coral, I feel that the surface has retained the sun's warmth on the exposed part, whereas the part that rested on the deck is colder. And if I were to split it in half, I could perhaps feel how the heat decreases from the top to the bottom. Now, in a warm body the atoms move more furiously, and therefore this rock, if it feels movement, cannot help but feel in its interior a differentiation of movements. If it were to remain eternally exposed to the sun in the same position, perhaps it would begin to distinguish something like an above and a below, if merely as two different types of motion. Unaware that the cause of this difference is an external agent, it would conceive itself in that way, as if that motion were its nature. But if there was an avalanche and the stone rolled downhill and ended in another position, it would feel that other parts of itself were moving, parts formerly slow, whereas those formerly fast would be moving at a slower pace. And as the terrain slid, and it could be a very slow process, the stone would feel that the heat, or rather, the motion consequent to it, was passing gradually from one part of it to another. Thinking like this, Roberto slowly exposed different sides of his body to the sun's rays, rolling across the deck until he came to a patch of shadow, darkening slightly in it, as would have happened to the stone. Who knows? He asked himself. Perhaps in these motions the stone begins to have, if not the concept of place, at least the notion of part, certainly, of change. Not of passion, however, because the stone does not know its opposite, which is action. Or perhaps it does. For the fact of being stone, so composed, is something it feels constantly, whereas its being hot here or cold there is felt alternately. So in some way it is capable of distinguishing itself, as substance, from its own accidents. Or not. Because it feels itself as relation, it would feel itself as relation among different accidents. It would feel itself as substance in evolution. What does that mean? Do I feel myself in a different way? Who knows if stones think like Aristotle or like the canon? All this in any case would take it millennia, but that is not the problem. It is whether the stone can store up successive perceptions of itself. Because if it feels itself now hot above and cold below, and now vice versa, but in the second condition it does not remember the first, then it will believe always that its interior movement is the same. But why, if it perceives itself, should it not have memory? Memory is a power of the soul, and however small the soul of the stone, it will have a proportionate memory. To have memory means to have a notion of before and after, otherwise I would also believe always that the suffering or the joy I remember are present at the moment I remember them. Instead I know they are past perceptions, because they are fainter than the present ones. The problem therefore is having a sense of time, which perhaps not even I could have if time were something that is learned. But did I not say to myself days or months ago, before my sickness, that time is the condition of movement and not the result? If the parts of the stone are in motion, this motion will have a rhythm that even if inaudible will be like the sound of a clock. The stone is the clock of itself. Feeling oneself in motion means feeling one's own time beating. The earth, great stone in the sky, feels the time of its motion, the time of the respiration of its tides, and what it feels I see drawn on the starry vault. The earth feels the same time that I see. So the stone knows time, indeed it knows it before perceiving its own changes of temperature as movement in space. As far as I know, it does not even need to sense that the change of temperature depends on its position in space. It could understand this as a phenomenon of change in time, like the passage from sleep to waking, from vigor to weariness, just as I realize now that, lying still, my left foot is growing numb. No, the stone must also feel space, if it senses motion where formerly there was stillness and stillness where formerly there was motion. It knows, then, how to think here and there. But let us now imagine that someone picks up this stone and sets it among other stones to build a wall. If, before, it sensed the play of its own internal positions, it was because it felt its own atoms bent in the effort to compose themselves like the cells in a beehive, crammed one against the other and one among others, as the stones in the dome of a church should feel, where one presses the other and all press towards the central keystone, and the stones near the keystone press the others downwards and outwards. But accustomed to that play of thrusts and counterthrusts, the whole dome must feel itself as such, in the invisible movement its bricks make, thrusting one another reciprocally. Similarly, it should feel the effort that someone makes to demolish it, and should understand that it ceases to be dome at the moment the wall below and its buttresses collapse. The stone, then, pressed among other stones to such a degree that it is on the verge of breaking, and if the pressure were greater, it would crack, must feel this constriction, a constriction it did not feel before, a pressure that somehow must influence its own inner movement. Will not this be the moment when the stone senses the presence of something external to itself? The stone would then have perception of the world. Or perhaps it would think that the force oppressing it is something stronger than itself, and it would identify the world with God. But on the day the wall collapses, ending the constriction, would the stone feel a sense of freedom, as I would feel if I decided to emerge from the constriction I have imposed on myself? But I can wish to stop being in my condition, the stone cannot. Therefore freedom is a passion, whereas the will to be free is an action, and this is the difference between me and the stone. I can will. The stone at most, and why not, can only tend to return as it was before the wall, and feel pleasure when it becomes again free. But it cannot decide to act in order to achieve what gives it pleasure. But can I really will anything? At this moment I feel the pleasure of being stone. The sun warms me. The wind makes acceptable this adjustment of my body. I have no intention of ceasing to be a stone. Why? Because I like it. So then I too am slave to a passion, which advises me against wanting freely its opposite. However, willing, I could will. And yet I do not. How much freer am I than a stone? There is no thought more terrible, especially for a philosopher, than that of free will. Out of philosophical pusillanimity, Roberto dismissed it as a thought too grave, for him, surely, and all the more for a stone to which he had given passions but had deprived of any possibility of action. In any case the stone, even without being able to ask itself questions about the possibility or impossibility of damning oneself willfully, had already acquired many and very noble faculties, more than human beings had ever attributed to it. Roberto now asked himself if, at the moment when it fell into the volcano, the stone was aware of its own death. Surely not, because it had never known what dying meant. But when it disappeared completely into the magma, could it have had a notion of its death as a thing that happened? No, because that composed, individual stone no longer existed. On the other hand, have we ever known of a man aware of having died? If something was thinking itself, it would now be the magma. I magma, I magma, I magma, schlup schlup schlup, I flow, fluid, plop plop splup, I bubble bub bub, I sizzle, spittle, spatter, patter, platter, plap. And Roberto, imagining himself magma, spat like a hydrophobe dog and tried to make his viscera grumble. He almost had a bowel movement. He was not made to be magma, better return to thinking like a stone. But what did it matter to the ex-stone that the magma was magmizing its magmating self? For stones there is no life after death.